order some food in a restaurant.
Now we have a live stream already. We are about to start. Okay, not yet. Okay, done. So I will make a super brief introduction to Nick Tune because I think that you don't need any introduction whatsoever. But hello, everybody, and welcome to our channel. Today we are delighted to welcome Nick Tune here with us to talk about his book, Architecture Modernization, that has been published recently. I don't know. I don't actually recall how recently it was published, Nick.
I came out in January. Yeah, January.
In January. So it's a very recent book. So Nick works as a principal consultant at Empathy Software. He works with the CTOs and technology leaders to define strategy, shape architecture, and build high-performing continuous delivery teams. So Nick, it's a pleasure. Thank you for coming here. And now it's your turn.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts about modernization. I'll try not to sell my book too hard. I'll just talk about some of the ideas, try and make the talk valuable in and of itself. So yeah, at the moment, I'm not actually working as a consultant. I'm working with one company called PayFit in France, doing some really interesting, big architectural change work. So yes, taking a bit of a different route away from like consulting, where I used to work with different clients at the same time. Before that in my career, I've had like tech lead roles, principal engineer, management roles. I had various different roles in my career, but always big changes, domain-driven design, continuous delivery. Those were the topics that always came up in my career. So I decided to write this book a few years ago during the pandemic as a side project. And then I didn't know what would happen with it, but it actually, we published it as a real book this year. So it did actually finish. So let's talk about modernization. And let's talk about the first question, like, why should you modernize? Does every company need to modernize at some point? Is there a reason why you might not want to modernize? And actually, there are lots of reasons why you might not want to modernize. And so your company might already be an established company. It might be the case that you might not have the best products in your industry, but people know your company's name and reputation. And even if your product isn't the best, your name is so well known and recognized that other customers won't switch to competitors because they trust your name, they know your name. So you already have market share, you're already making money, you've got economies of scale if you have multiple products, you might have the industry's most talented people, you can pay higher salaries. And then there's also things like lock-in and switching costs. Again, even if other companies build a better product than you, it might be hard for customers to switch away from your products because you get your data's in that product, your people know how to use that product, you might be involved in the industry around a certain product. Certainly when I worked at Salesforce, for example, there was a whole community around training and badges and certifications, and there was the big Salesforce Dreamforce conference every year. So when we think about lock-in and switching costs, the whole ecosystem around a product can make it very difficult to switch away. So you might not need to modernize. Your company might be successful just because it already has a well-known brand and it's an existing market leader. But for many companies, that's definitely not the case. Software does become a big problem as it gets older and harder to change, stuck on old technologies. You then build up processes in your organization that make you slow and bureaucratic because your systems are difficult to change and you need more compliance and safety around that. And at the other end of the scale, some companies feel like they don't need to modernize because they do have a successful brand, a well-known brand. And that can become complacent, and that can be how new companies enter your industry and take your position as market leader. So those companies do need to innovate. And these companies can, if a new company enters your industry, they can go straight to the latest technologies. You might be on some legacy technology from 20 years ago, and a new startup can use the best that AWS or Microsoft has to offer from day one. And that's a serious advantage. Good example of this is OpenTable. Around about 10 years ago, my friend Orlando was working there, plus some of my other friends worked there. They recognized that if they didn't make some changes, they would lose their position as market leader. They could have carried on as a market leader, just building new features, but they realized, we have this monolith, we've got 100 developers working in it, we deploy once a month, developing new features is difficult. We can already see competitors entering the market, being more successful, delivering faster, and at some point in the near future, that will mean that they take our position as market leader. Another aspect of why you might need to modernize is that even if you do make great decisions, even if all your decisions around your architecture are perfect, as the environment changes, as your company's context changes, suddenly those decisions that were good before might be bad decisions now. And you might have a system which is overly complex and more difficult than it needs to be because those factors changed. Good example of that is Vinted. And to be honest, I think every company I work at, I see this kind of pattern. So basically with Vinted, they started out as a company selling women's clothing. They built a system for selling women's clothing. And then as they moved into new verticals, they were finding it a bit more difficult to add features because the system wasn't designed for those other verticals. It was designed for women's clothing. And that kind of happens, I think, to every system, as I was talking about. You build it to support some use cases, and then you have to support other use cases, and you keep supporting new use cases. And the way you initially designed the system didn't realize or wasn't expecting to support those use cases. So those are built in a kind of in a suboptimal way, and each layer that gets built on top becomes more difficult to work with. So I would say, if you're thinking about modernization, or what is modernization, it's this ability to convert your architecture from a disadvantage into a competitive advantage. I like to think of modernization as something that established companies do, something they invest in, so that they can innovate, they can move at the speed of younger companies like startups, for example. The best of both worlds, an established brand, a reputable brand, and also being able to move quickly. So I'll talk a few different parts of modernization. There's 3 different parts of this talk. One is around the concept of flow. I'll talk a bit more about why that's important. I'll share some of the tools with you that I cover in the book that I think are really important if you're modernizing. And I'll talk about some of the approaches to help you get modernization started, to keep things moving, the whole project management, change management piece. I think all these factors are important, the conceptual, the tools, and also the real life day-to-day making the change happen. So I talked about modernization as a competitive advantage. And as I was alluding to, what we really mean is being able to innovate at a competitive speed, not falling behind our competition. So what we're saying is an architecture should enable work to flow faster in our organization. And that's why, from that perspective, if you only modernize your tech, if you only update your programming languages and infrastructure technologies, then you won't get the full benefits of modernization and having a faster flow. Modern technologies do give you benefits that I talked about. If you're using a programming language that came out today versus one that came out like 30 years ago, yeah, it's probably going to have all kinds of features that make it much easier to work with. But changing the technologies alone won't fix all the coupling in your system, all those design decisions that are no longer optimal for the problem you're solving, as we talked about with the Vinted example. So from a conceptual perspective, when we modernize, we're trying to not just modernize our software system, but we're trying to modernize entire value streams. So if we want to have the full benefits of modernization so we can get work done faster, then we need to think about modernization as a way to make workflow faster through our organization. So I think if you're modernizing, you need to be thinking about the whole value stream. So a value stream is basically all the sequences particular kind of work goes through. So if you want to implement a new feature, well, you have to decide what feature should we build. You then break it up into slices. You implement a slice of value. You deploy it, support it in production. And if you have fast flow, you're able to deliver lots of small slices every day. I worked at companies where we deploy multiple times per day, a single button click. And for me, that's what a good architect should enable. It should enable the teams to get their work done faster through this value stream. So there are some key points here that I think are worth mentioning, and probably the most important one is the concept of change coupling. So if I go back to the previous slide, we might have this value stream, we have this team that owns their piece of the architecture, and they can deploy their software without having dependencies on other teams. But while there might be no obvious physical connections in the software, we still have to look for change coupling. And change coupling is where you implement one feature and it affects multiple different parts of your code base. So even though there might be no API calls or shared code or shared database, you can still have this concept of change coupling. So how do we avoid that? We avoid that by looking at these 4 key different factors. So the first one is domain aligned. Your architecture needs to be a domain aligned in the sense that you need to understand what are the different parts of your business. How can you identify loosely coupled parts of your business? And that's basically the question, when we implement a new feature, how can we be sure that it will only affect one team? It's not always the case. You can't always achieve that. But if you identify the domains in your business, then the domains represent domain concepts that are cohesive and changing together. So that will give you a good starting point for loose coupling in your architecture. We also need to know which business outcomes we're optimizing for. Are we moving into new markets? Are we optimizing for revenue, reducing costs? All these things are crucial to making the right trade-offs at how to design our architecture. And we also need to ensure that teams are empowered. If you have a loosely coupled architecture, but teams have to raise tickets to deploy their code, or teams aren't able to make decisions about their roadmap, then they're going to be blocked anyway. So your super loosely coupled architecture won't actually address the main causes of work being slow in your organization. And as I was talking about, each value stream should have its software that can be deployed by the team that owns it. So decoupled in that sense. Good example of this is a company called ICE Technology. ICE Services, sorry, my friend Casper works here. They're in the domain of music royalties. Initially, they had an architecture that had grown organically. They had large teams of 10 to 12 people. They had architectural boundaries that were more driven by technical concepts like import and export. And as a result of this, the time it took them to calculate royalties was quite high, and that was affecting the overall performance of their business. It was about getting royalties to the people who should be paid as soon as possible. So by applying those concepts, domain aligned, outcome oriented, team empowered, they had a new architecture, which you can see on the bottom here. They used concepts like event storming, which I'll talk about later, to get here. But they had these subdomains which were based on areas of the business that people considered independent. So instead of the word import export, you now see things like usage ingestion, distribution claims, royalty calculation. All of these words come from the business domain. They're not words that were invented by technical people when they were designing a system. And each team was able to deploy on demand as they needed to. And as you can see, some of the outcomes that were improved on the right-hand side were quite important, reducing processing times by 80%, increasing the matching progress by 5x. I'm not saying that this company read my book and achieved this. What I'm saying is the ideas in my book are based on what Casper and his team did by applying concepts like domain-driven design and empowered teams. And these are the kind of metrics that you should be looking for. If you're modernizing and you don't know which metrics will improve when you finish modernizing, well, that's kind of a warning sign that you're not ready to modernize. You don't have a clear narrative. Another key point here is if you just rewrite the old system and keep all existing functionality, you might spend a lot of money, you might waste a lot of money and time building things that aren't necessary, and your modernization will take longer and it might not even succeed. So basically, there are research and studies and reports out there like this one that say up to 80% of the features in your current system are not used or rarely used. So if you're modernizing and you modernize your 100% of your system and keep 100% of the functionality, 80% of what you modernize might just be completely wasted time and effort. So modernization is a chance to rethink how the actual product works, simplify the code, add new features, delete things that aren't used anymore. So I think it's important to take this full stack approach where you modernize the software, but you can also ask, should we modernize the user journey, the user experience? Can we modernize the domain model? I talked earlier of the example from Vinted. They had a domain model based on women's clothing, and they built new features on top of that domain model. In your system, maybe you can redesign your domain model to better fit all the use cases you support, rather than being driven by the ones that were initially supported. And as I was talking about, you can modernize the domain itself. You can add new features, you can simplify processes, you can automate manual steps. What other improvements can you make whilst you're improving the tech? When I worked with the UK government in 2016 on business property taxes, I got to see this full stack really to a degree I'd not seen before. So we had user researchers in the team. They were going out every week talking to citizens of the UK, trying to understand their needs. We used new tech stacks. We adopted domain-driven microservices. We had a platform that enabled us to deploy every day. And then on the domain level, we were rewriting the law, basically. The law had existed for decades or even 100 years or more, some of these business rules. And the scope was we can change the law to improve the product or service if we need to. I'm not saying you would do this everywhere for your entire system, but it's always worth asking yourself, for each part of our system, what could we modernize? Where's the ROI here? What can we delete? What can we add from the UI layer to how the business works itself? If you're investing all this time in changing your tech, changing some of these other things might not be much of an extra cost, or it might actually save you time because you realize things can be simplified or removed. So that's kind of a conceptual look at my view on modernization. Modernization is about enabling companies to innovate faster by having a better flow of work through better architecture. And here are some of the tools I recommend to help you with modernization. So the first one's listening. Listening is a great skill to have. What I'm talking about here is listening tours specifically. So before you start modernizing, before you start making plans or designs, just go out and talk to lots of people in your company, all different kind of stakeholders. Try and understand what are their problems and challenges. And by doing this, you will be able to have a narrative that's business and products driven and not a tech narrative. When people think of modernization, you want them to think of improving our product, improving our business, not, oh, the developers are migrating to the AWS on the cloud. You want this to be business driven. And by having this listening tours, you can start to understand what everyone in your company finds valuable. And it's also a good chance to build relationships and start gaining some trust of those people, because that will come in handy very later when you have to make some difficult compromises. It's very easy to ask bad questions, things like, oh, I know you're unproductive at the moment. Why don't you use Salesforce to make yourself more productive? You've told someone they're unproductive. You've told them what the solution is. In these listening tours, you want to really let those things emerge. Try not to ask leading questions. So I do recommend spending some time thinking about how to have conversations and not bias those conversations with your thoughts or solutions too early. Talked about business objectives earlier. As I said, I don't think you can modernize unless you have clear business objectives. And that's where techniques like impact mapping come very useful. When you're talking to all these different stakeholders and you're getting lots of ideas and feedback about what's important, it can feel quite messy. So impact mapping can help you to add some structure. You can go from a top-level business objective all the way to a specific modernization investments you want to make and have a clear line there. So whenever someone says, why are you modernizing? You can say, well, this piece of work is crucial for the 20 million plus revenue that we need to earn in the next 2 years, which you can see in this example here. So that was the big goal, 20 million plus revenue. And then this company, this example is a company that wanted to focus on their enterprise users. They felt that was an area of growth. I can't stress enough how understanding how your company wants to grow is super crucial, because you really want to make sure you're focusing on parts that will help the company to grow and not things that are complex legacy that you don't like, but maybe aren't that valuable to modernizing. So then here there's 2 impacts: improve accuracy rate or reduce the lead time. If we can improve those metrics for these customers, then we'll get some big benefits. And then on the right-hand side in deliverables, you can see some examples that would lead to those improvements, some technical improvements. Another tool is Wardley mapping. Wardley mapping is useful because it helps you to look at your overall system and identify where do we need to invest and how should we invest in each area, as we touched on earlier. So what you can see here is a value chain. You start with a user, customer, or restaurant in this example, and you have their user need. And then in the purple, you have all of the components of your system that fit together to enable those user needs. So in this example, we have a customer mobile app, which talks to a menu service, it talks to an ordering service, and they're both running on a cloud platform. At this point, the value streams aren't that useful. They become useful when you start mapping them to evolution. So with Wardley mapping, there are these 4 different stages of evolution. On the left-hand side, you have Genesis. These are new, exciting ideas that could be big opportunities for growth or improvement for the business in the future. And commodity is the boring old features, things that your product just has to do, that just have to work, where you're probably not going to be innovating that much in the future. So by mapping your components, you can then start to understand what kind of modernization are we aiming for here. If we're more towards the left-hand side, we know that the company will probably be innovating a lot in these areas. So we need a fast flow of changes here. We need to be able to modernize quickly. So loose coupling, empowered teams, all those things are super crucial there. As you move to the right-hand side towards commodity, now we just want to have something stable and functional, running for the least amount of cost possible. So there, our modernization focus might be reducing costs. Another important factor of Wardley mapping: don't make decisions based on the current position of a component. You need to also think about evolution. So with a Wardley map, all of your components move from left to right. You build a new feature, it's this exciting new idea, you develop it, and at some point it becomes, there's not much more you can do to improve it. At the same time, all of the companies, all of your competitors are also building new features similar to try and copy or have a better version of what you have. And because of that innovation, that competitive nature of your industry, this evolution will happen. You just don't know how quickly. So it's good to ask questions like, for how many more years will we continue to invest in this feature? What are our competitors doing? Can we protect this advantage we have, or will the competitors catch us up very soon? By understanding those things, you can then decide, oh, okay, in a year from now, this will be a commodity. So let's treat it like a commodity now, even if it's more customer product at the moment. The 4th tool is event storming, and there's 2 flavors here. The first one is big picture. So big picture is a way to map out parts of your business using domain events, which are orange Post-it notes you can see here. You bring together lots of stakeholders, product people, developers, testers, data scientists, sales, marketing, all your domain experts, and you work together to build this big view of your business. And that can help you to identify, what things are currently being used? What room for improvement do we have? Where do we have spreadsheets that can be replaced with actual code instead? Process modeling is about how to design the future states. So you know how the system currently works, how should it work in the future, which things can be removed, how can the domain model be improved, what new features can be added, what can be simplified. So event storming is a super useful technique I'm using all the time. I definitely recommend this one. It's also a great way to start defining your new architecture. As we talked about earlier, if you want a loosely coupled architecture, we need to identify parts of our business which are loosely coupled or cohesive. And with event storming, you have all these orange events, these domain events, along the timeline, and then you can start to discuss in your groups how should we organize these events, which ones feel like they're connected and which ones feel separate. In this example here, you can see there's an e-commerce domain, and within that domain there are 3 subdomains: search and browse, cart and checkout, and ordering. E-commerce is quite a boring example, but it gets the point across. Usually there's all kinds of different considerations and trade-offs and ways to slice things up. So the 5th tool, the final tool, is a tool for actually making choices about how much to modernize. I've seen other tools like this out there, but some of them are more salesy from the cloud vendors. So basically, for each part of your system, when you come to decide how much do we modernize, I think there are 2 factors to consider. As I talked about, there's the tech side. So will you modernize the infrastructure, the programming languages, the libraries, databases, frameworks even? How much of that will you modernize for each part of your system? And then there's the domain and software modernization. How much will you modernize the code, its design, the domain model, the functionality? So I think it's important to look across both of those different axes for each part of your system. So you might decide we're going to just maintain what's there now. We might do minor version upgrades and fix bugs, but for this part of the system, it's in a commodity. It doesn't cost us much to run. We're not going to improve it in the future. Just maintaining what's there is good enough for now. For some pieces, you might want to do lift and shift. You might say, oh, we have to get out of the current data center and move to the cloud, but we don't want to change the code. So for this particular subsystem, lift and shift is okay. And then for some subsystems, you might say, we want to totally reinvent this. We want to change the business rules, the domain model, the UI, the user journey. So we'll go all in on modernization there. So the key here is to think carefully about each part of your system and think about what kind of modernization and what level is going to be optimal. There's another tool I haven't mentioned, which I think is very interesting, which is CodeScene. It's able to scan your version control history and identify parts of your system that are coupled, where you have a lack of knowledge, where people have left the company and stuff. So I think maybe in a couple of years, this might be the 6th tool in my list, but I'm still in the evaluation, learning about this tool phase at the moment. So last thing I want to quickly talk about is how you can actually manage modernization in terms of being a project and change management as a journey to keep it moving in a good pace. So a couple of things I want to clarify. I talked about Wardley mapping and event storming as being these amazing tools, which I think they are. But what I'm not saying is do that everywhere for your entire system. That could take you years to do that, and it might not be worth it. In fact, I encourage almost every company try and deliver something in the first 3 to 6 months. Some people think it's not possible to do that, and sometimes it might not be, but most of the time it is. And I think it's important because you want to start learning, validating your ideas, and also demonstrating that, hey, this modernization isn't just ideas on paper. We have delivered something. We are showing progress. And then people will start to believe it's actually going to happen. Until you deliver something, I think people are always very skeptical. Oh, they're talking about modernizing, but I'm not seeing anything. I'm not sure if I actually believe it. Will it happen? I'm just going to keep working as normal and ignore modernization. So try and deliver early, definitely recommended. Choosing a first slice is difficult. I won't go through this whole chart here, but the basic idea is, do you start with something simple and easy, or do you start with something which has little value, or do you start with something more complex and more valuable? If you start with something complex and valuable, then you might hit a lot of problems and issues because it's the first thing you're modernizing. So because it's a complex topic, there could be a lot of problems and it could drag out for a very long time. So you might say, let's pick something simple. Then we can validate some initial ideas and then do something more complex after. The problem here is if you go to the bottom left, if you're too risk averse then people start saying, why are those developers modernizing some irrelevant part of the system? They spent 6 months. We could have built some new features, but we let them modernize and we're not getting any value from this. So I think it's always important to really consider the options and think what's going to work best in your company. Even if you want to start small, even if it is ideally your preferred approach, you might have to accept that in the company you're working in, people want to see something more valuable sooner, and you might have to take a bit more risk in that case. Then there's these workshops I recommend called Kickstarter workshops. It's basically you get together for 3 to 5 days and you try and do a full slice all the way from understand your business objectives, map out parts of your business with event storming, identify your domains and subdomains, identify how much you want to invest in each area, and then start to build a roadmap for the first couple of months. You can't do all of that in a 3 to 5 day workshop, but if you get all of the right people together, you can make a lot of progress in 3 to 5 days and have a solid plan for modernizing. If you're trying to do this remotely and it's all done via emails and Slack conversations and ad hoc workshops, you can make progress that way, but sometimes just getting in person in a workshop together, a well-designed workshop, you can make a lot of progress. You can make like 6 months of progress in a few days, I would say sometimes. This workshop here, me and my colleague Eduardo, we worked with a company in Canada. As you can see, we mapped out this whole process on the wall and we identified like 10, 15 subdomains there. And there was someone from the sales team who told us about this 80-step process that was all done via spreadsheets. A lot of discoveries came up like that. And then after doing this on day one, we picked some particular subdomains and started exploring how to modernize them in the following days. So the workshops can be useful, but very often you have great workshops and then nothing happens. And then people start to not enjoy workshops or not care because they feel like the workshops never lead anywhere. So you need some mechanism, some structure in your organization to ensure that there is some momentum to keep things moving. The concepts that I talk about in the book, one of the concepts I recommend is called an AMET, an Architecture Modernization Enabling Team. If you've read team topologies, you'll know that an enabling team is a team that is there to help and support others. And that's basically what an AMET does. It's a group that has architectural skills, leadership skills, coaching skills. And this team of people is able to identify any problems that are holding modernization back and support them. So it could be working with the CTO or some senior stakeholders to clarify the vision one day. The next day, it could be helping teams to design parts of their architecture. This team really does need quite a broad range of skills so they can address all of the problems that pop up. You don't have to do this, but it's one pattern I recommend thinking about. And so that's basically it. That's a quick overview of a lot of the stuff in the book. Not everything, but those are the key concepts. So I would say, should you modernize is the first question. Your company might have a lot of legacy software, but you might have a successful brand. Your position as market leader might be unchallenged and modernization just might not be worth it. If you do want to modernize, and I think you need to take a flow mindset, how can we design a system that enables work to pass through our organization faster? So thinking about value streams. And then making sure that you apply all of the different kinds of tools that are needed. So listening to people, listening to all the different stakeholders, understanding what's important to them. Things like event storming to map out parts of your business and understand how your business works. Wardley mapping, impact mapping to think about what's the business value, and the strategy selector to identify what's the optimal investment, the optimal modernization investment that we could pick for each part of our system, and not taking some global approach where you spend a lot of time and effort for modernizing things that aren't worth it. And then finally, you're going to have the problem of how do we keep modernization moving? How do we make sure that these ideas that we have in workshops and on whiteboards actually turn into real changes to our system? And that's where things like architecture modernization enabling teams can be very useful. You have people dedicated to making sure that modernization succeeds, and they address any issues that arise. So that's basically it. I'm happy to take any questions or talk about any of those points in more detail.
Nick, thank you very much. We do have indeed a couple of questions, but first of all, I think it was an amazing introduction to the book of yours. I think it will have an impact in the industry, and this part of making the development team understand what are the objectives, like the business objectives of the company. I think it's crucial, because here as well, I think that the whole requirements start to change, and estimations as well. Once the business team and the technology team, they are aligned about the objectives of the business. So thank you very much for your effort in writing the book. So we have the very first question here. It's coming from Ivan. And what strategies would you recommend to avoid some pitfalls of complexity that can lead to system failure during modernization process?
Could you? I was sorry. I was looking for the question in the comments to read it.
Yeah. So I'm reading the one that come from Ivan Suarez. So great talk, Nick. What strategies would you recommend to avoid some pitfalls of complexity? Yeah.
Okay. So pitfalls of complexity that can lead to system failure during the modernization process.
Yeah.
So what comes to my mind straight away here is the migration. Because basically, for most companies, modernization will be a period of, we have some old systems and some new stuff, and they're running side by side. Sometimes you might have legacy systems that you don't kill and they live forever or a long time. They might never go away, and that can be okay. So I think the first thing I would say, and something I'm working on at the moment, actually, with the team I'm currently working with, is the synchronization. Think about how you will keep the old systems and the new systems synchronized. You might need a range of different tools here. I think domain-driven design can be very useful, thinking about your domain events and having conceptual boundaries. So, for example, what was I going to say? Lost my trail of thought there. I had a couple of things in my head. So the first thing I was going to say is, at the moment, for example, what we've done is for the piece of the system we're working on, we mapped out all of the places where either a write is happening or a read is happening in the legacy. So we have full visibility. Here are all of the other domains or external systems that are either requesting data or pushing data into the legacy system, the part that we own. And our plan is now, how do we migrate gradually, step by step, moving the reads or the writes in an incremental fashion? The approach we've taken is to start with the writes. We'll get all of the writes coming into the new system, and we'll have all of the reads still going to the old system. And then once we have all of the writes, we'll move all of the reads later. It's not always the approach I would take. Sometimes you might do the reads first, or you might do a use case first. We'll take this write and this read, move those together, because that enables a full feature. So I would say having a clear overview of all the reads and the writes that are happening, and knowing that when you move one of those from the legacy to the new system, which others might be impacted, and just so making sure you sequence that in the right order.
This is a great one. I would say, nice response, Nick. We have another question here coming from Miguel. And how do you balance the need for a quick wins with the long-term vision of a comprehensive modernization strategy?
Yeah, great question. In general, I would say quick wins usually win. And what happens is you get 2 or 3 years into modernization, and some of the real big challenges haven't been addressed yet. So common example is companies moving to microservices. Oh, we have 15 microservices, great, but they're all still talking to the old legacy database that hasn't been touched. And it's like, yeah, it was easy to change the code, but when we asked for like 2 or 3 months to do some database changes, because it was more effort, we couldn't get support for that. So yeah, very often those more complex pieces do get left until the end. So it's not always easy to get investment in those. I think, my strategy for those kind of things is who's the most senior technical person. Try and make sure of why it's important to address those more complex technical features. Someone like the CTO, for example, they've got a good relationship with the other senior stakeholders like chief product officer, CEO. So if you can get buy-in with your CTO, for example, or maybe you are the CTO, then it's different. But I think trying to get buy-in from the people you work closely with, the senior people you work closely with, that can help. And then I think the other part is really all around the narrative, having a compelling narrative that is able to connect the business goals to modernization. Where I'm working at Payfit now, that's one of the things that is working so well. Like the whole company understands why all of these technical transformation work is happening, because they know if we do this technical transformation work, the areas the business wants to grow in the next 3 to 5 years will become possible. At the moment, they're not even, well, I can't give away too much, but let's just say some things either are very difficult to achieve at the moment, very expensive, or they're not possible. And with this technical transformation work, they will either become possible now or easier to achieve for less cost, or be able to achieve them quicker. So yeah, I think the narrative is crucial. There's a whole range of techniques there. I think the listening tours have always been a very effective technique for me, because I talk to these different stakeholders. I try and build trust with them, try and make them feel like I'm listening to them, and try and not make them feel like I have an agenda. So when it does come to those difficult conversations of let's spend 6 months modernizing and not building new features, hopefully they trust you and they're like, I'm not sure about this, but he or she seems like an okay person, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here. So I think, yeah, getting trust from the senior people with the other stakeholders, that's key, and also you yourself trying to build trust. And then finally, that narrative that connects business goals to modernization. And sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes a part of that is almost kind of a fear. I wouldn't say you need to scare people, but you want them to realize, like, if we don't do this modernization work, in 2 to 3 years, all these things that you want to achieve won't happen, and we might not be market leader. And that might be the truth. You might be telling them the truth, but just being honest, just creating a sense of, like, we should be worried if we don't modernize. There will be some problems here.
Definitely, Nick. So much truth in this part. We have another pretty long comment coming from Javier Rodriguez. So, and what he wants to know, if basically, Nick, if you do agree or don't agree, and in what part of the comments. I will try to read it, but also you will be, I guess, reading it at the same time. I think that the methodologies and processes you outline excel in a product-oriented company. However, there are companies that outsource the modernization and frame it in time, turning it in project-oriented. This especially happens in companies where software is not their core offering, but seen as a supporting one. So my final question is, would you discourage outsourcing architecture modernization?
I think there are different levels of outsourcing. I think one part of me says, you wouldn't want to outsource it because you want all of that knowledge yourself in the company. Plus, when you outsource things, the outsourcing partners don't necessarily have the same incentives you have. So you need to really trust them. On the other hand, if you're a company that's got lots of legacy and you've been working in a more traditional way of working, you might not have the skills to modernize. People who've been working through Jira tickets, making small changes in legacy systems, they don't have all of these skills to modernize. So you do need some outside help. I think that's fair to say. When I worked at the UK government, it was quite a good mix, actually. It was a mix of internal people and external contractors. So the government was able to leverage consultancies like Equal Experts, but there was always some connection to people who work for the government. There was always some knowledge and skills transfer. So if all of those contractors did leave, most of the knowledge would still be retained inside the company. And also, people in the company were growing and learning from this opportunity as well. So I think it varies. Someone did say to me once that they are working on this approach to modernizing, where they can take your old system and rewrite it in a new tech stack, and it will work exactly how the old one works. Now, I did say don't do that, because if you just rewrite the old system in new tech, you won't fix all of the coupling. But what that does give you is it will give you your old legacy system in a new modern programming language, and then you might want to modernize it from there yourself. So I think it's always very tricky. I definitely wouldn't just outsource the whole thing and let someone else do that. Probably wouldn't go that far. But leveraging external expertise usually does make sense in some capacity.
Here, if I can add my 5 cents here, we've seen clients that we saw it would be even better to convert the actual developers into stakeholders, like business stakeholders mostly, and outsourcing the whole thing to an external partner, because technically, like from the technical side, it was a much better solution for it. But obviously, it was a small company, like relatively, but it was a great question. And we have one final comment coming from Hector, and in his opinion, the need to modernize any software starts from the developers who know how hard is the maintenance or add new features to the software. What's the best approach to explain it to the business layer?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of developers are in this situation right now. They're dealing with some legacy software, and unfortunately, the business just doesn't realize how bad the software is and how good it could be. And sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes I feel like modernization is only possible when there's a big enough problem and people realize, oh, we really have to do this now. Like, we can't hold this off any longer. Like, our product just went down for like a whole week and it's all over the news, and it's like, we have to do something now. Sometimes until it gets to that point, people just keep adding new features, unfortunately. But I think there's a lot. Not every company's at that extreme. I think there's a lot you can do. And again, I think this is what a good technical lead is able to do. Is able to connect business narratives, business objectives back to the technology roadmap, and to highlight, like, if we were to invest a year in this, the cost of change would go from a month to 2 days. One of the case studies in the book from a company called Mobile.d, they talk about this. In their company, they have this concept called cost of change. And so the whole business understands that whenever we build a new feature, the cost of change goes up, which means the next feature we build is going to be more expensive because the last one made the system more complex, and that increases the costs. So I think something like that is important, a way to explain how the system gets more complex and it becomes more expensive to add new features, some kind of narrative like that. I also think tools like CodeScene can help in this area, and I wonder if they can do even more in the future. One of the companies I worked with, they were saying, should we fire all of the contractors? And the new CTO who came in said, well, if you fire all the contractors, you'll lose knowledge of 60% of your system. because code team can tell you, here are all the parts of your system, here are the people who've worked on it, and these people who worked on this part over here, they're all contractors. So if you lose those people, you lose all of the knowledge about that part of the system. And you might say, well, we'll do like a handover, but really a technical handover is never that effective in my experience. Like, oh, spend 1 or 2 days with the team who are leaving and they'll explain how it works. Normally takes a couple of months to really start getting to grips with the code base. So you'll need something more in depth. Yeah, so very, very good question, a very common challenge. And I would say you can definitely try connecting business goals, talking about opportunities, explaining, using things like Wardley mapping to say this component in a few years, if this is going to be our core advantage as a company, we just can't iterate fast enough there right now. If we were to invest, we could iterate much faster. And the other one's fear, trying to make people worry that things might go wrong. Yeah, and sometimes you might just have to wait for that to happen. Unfortunately, I think so. I don't think it's possible to solve this problem in every company. I think some companies, the desire to just build new features as quickly as possible is just too strong to overcome.
Yes, and I think that this is very related to one of the first questions related to the trust that the technical part has to generate with probably these quick wins. And after having generated this trust, like to keep proposing and keep pushing for to keep reducing the technical debt and to modernizing actually the software.
Yeah, definitely. That would be a good example of where a quick win can come in. If you can deliver something in 3 to 6 months or even less, like the example I gave of iServices where my friend Casper works, where they improve the processing time by 80%. If you can find something like that, which is, it's always good, yeah, to demonstrate what's possible.
So I guess this is it. Nick, thank you so much for your time and for being here with us. And hopefully we will have you again soon in the future.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming, and good luck with your future Book Club sessions.
Thank you.